Now we're going to talk about the collection process. It is one of the most important parts of the invoicing configuration. Okay, the collection process is launched on the invoice generation date, and it's a set of payment conditions that we define for our customers in our Porta billing system. The two main goals of the collection process is to increase the chances of payment and to reduce time from the invoice generation to payment. It has two possible outcomes, either the successful outcome when the payment is received or the unsuccessful one when the payment is not received and the customer is deleted from the Porta billing system. The collection process is configured entirely on the customer class, meaning that none of the parameters that we are going to discuss next can be changed for an individual customer. The collection process consists of important dates: the due date, the suspension date, and the termination date, invoice statuses, and some additional configurations that we're going to look at in our practical part. Before any of the dates can be calculated, we need to set our grace period. The grace period is the number of days allowed to pay the invoice without any additional penalty. Okay, the due date is the date when the invoice becomes overdue if no payment is received, and the due date is calculated as the invoice generation date plus the grace period. Okay, why can't the due date be set directly? Why do we need this grace period instead? Because we don't know the invoice generation date in advance. It can vary depending on the system load, and if a customer has a monthly billing period, for example, and the invoice is expected on April 1st, it doesn't necessarily mean that the system will dispose of enough resources to generate the invoice on April 1st, especially if we have thousands of customers. And the invoices may be generated in batches. Some of the invoices will be generated on April 1st, some of them on April 2nd, and so on and so forth. So for the purpose of fairness, we give each customer exactly the same number of days to pay the invoice independently from the invoice generation date. So the due date depends on the grace period. The due date is, as I already said, is calculated as our invoice generation date plus grace period. So for example, if the grace period is set to 30 days and the invoice generation date is April 1st, our due date will be May 1st. Okay, on May 1st, the invoice will become overdue. We can set additional reminders in our Porta billing system before the due date so that the customer knows that the invoice will soon become overdue. Our next date is the suspension date. The suspension date is the date when the customer will lose access to the services. Is set as a fixed number of days after the due date. As the due date itself depends on the grace period, suspension date depends on the grace period as well. We can also configure reminders to let the customer know that the suspension is coming up. Once the customer pays all the overdue invoices, the suspension is lifted. Okay, and next we have a termination date. The termination date is our worst case scenario when the customer failed to pay the invoice during a very long time, and we are not really expecting to receive a payment. It is also set as a fixed number of days after the due date. When the termination date comes up, the customer will be deleted from the Porta billing system. We can set reminders before the termination date so that the customer knows that they have a last chance to pay the invoice.